I never liked our basement. Even as a kid, something about it felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling. The kind that made your skin prickle and your instincts scream at you to get out. My parents always dismissed it as childish paranoia, but even now, years later, I know I wasn't imagining it. Our house was old, built sometime in the early 1900s. The basement was unfinished, just a concrete floor, wooden support beams, and a single bare light bulb that flickered no matter how many times we replaced it. The worst part, though, was the basement door. It was heavy, old wood, and it never seemed to close right. No matter how hard we shut it, sometimes we'd wake up in the morning to find it slightly open. My dad insisted it was just a draft, but that explanation never sat right with me. The last time I ever set foot in that basement was a few years ago. I was home from college for the summer, staying with my parents while they were away on a trip. I had the house to myself for the week, which I thought would be relaxing, until the third night. I was in the living room, watching TV when I heard it. A thump. It came from the basement. I froze listening. A few seconds later, another thump, followed by a dragging sound. I muted the TV, my heart pounding. It was probably just the water heater or something, I told myself. But then I heard something else, a whisper. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. A voice, low, murmuring, coming from behind the basement door. Every muscle in my body screamed at me not to move, but I couldn't just sit there waiting. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and made my way to the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the knob. The door was open, only an inch or two, but open. I know I had closed it earlier. I stood there, straining to hear. Silence, but the kind of silence that feels full, like something is waiting. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow, uneven, coming up the basement stairs. I backed away, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. Maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway. And then, the door creaked open, just a little bit more. I didn't wait. I turned and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My phone was in my room, and I immediately called the police, barely able to get the words out. I told them someone was in my house, that they had come up from the basement. The wait for them felt like a lifetime. I sat on my bed, heart hammering, staring at my bedroom door, expecting it to open at any second. But nothing happened. When the police arrived, they searched the entire house. The basement, the closets, even outside. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no explanation. Except one thing. The basement door was wide open. One of the officers noticed something that made my stomach drop. The inside of the basement door frame, where the wood met the latch, was covered in deep scratched up marks, as if someone, had been trying to claw their way out. I moved out of that house the next year. My parents eventually sold it, and I never went back. I don't know what was down in that basement, and I never want to find out. I never liked the basement in my house. Growing up, I avoided it as much as possible. It wasn't just the darkness or the damp, musty smell. It was the feeling. Every time I went down there, I felt like I wasn't alone. Like something was watching me from the shadows. But when my parents passed and I inherited the house, I had no choice but to deal with it. It was an old place, built in the 1950s, and the basement was unfinished. Just concrete floors, exposed pipes, and a single hanging bulb that barely lit the space. There was a rickety wooden door in the back that led to some kind of sub-basement, but it had been locked for as long as I could remember. One night, while organizing some of my parents' old boxes, I heard something, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze. It was coming from the locked door. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes or the house settling. But then it happened again. This time it was louder. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But something kept me there, some morbid curiosity or sheer stupidity. I moved closer, my breath shallow. My hand hovered over the doorknob, even though I knew it was locked. And then, as if in response, a voice whispered from the other side, "Let me out." I staggered backward, my stomach turning to ice. The voice was hoarse, desperate, but what made my skin crawl was how familiar it sounded. It sounded like me. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I could still hear it, faintly, through the floorboards. Let me out. The next morning, I did what any sane person would do. I called a locksmith. I told him I'd lost the key and needed the basement door opened. He arrived that afternoon, an older guy who didn't ask too many questions. He worked the lock for a few minutes, then grunted. "That's strange," he muttered. "This ain't a normal lock. Looks like it was sealed shut." Before I could ask what he meant, there was a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black space beyond. The air that rushed out was stale, like it had been trapped for decades. I hesitated, but the locksmith just shone his flashlight inside. "Looks like another storage area," he said. I took the flashlight from him and stepped inside. The room was small, lined with old wooden shelves. Dust covered everything. But then I noticed something in the center of the floor, something that made my stomach drop. It was a chair, and around it, scattered on the concrete, were deep, frantic scratch marks, like someone had been clawing at the floor. And then I saw the chains, rusted, thick chains that lay in a pile near the chair, as if they had once bound something, or someone. That's when the whisper came again, but this time, it wasn't behind a door. It was right next to me. "I told you to let me out." The flashlight flickered. My breath caught in my throat, and in the dim, failing light, I saw something shift in the corner, a shadow that was darker than the rest. I ran. I don't even remember getting up the stairs. I barely remember locking the basement door behind me, but I do remember the sound that followed me, a slow, deliberate creak, the sound of the sub-basement door opening. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't gone back down there since, but at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear it, scratching and breathing. I never liked my basement. Something about it always felt off. Even as a kid, I would sprint up the stairs the moment I turned off the light, my heart hammering like something was right behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination. That was until a few months ago, when I learned I wasn't entirely wrong. I had moved back into my childhood home after my father passed away. It was just me now. The house was old, creaky and drafty, but it was home. Basement, however, remained just as unsettling as I remembered. I avoided it when I could, only going down when necessary, usually to reset the breaker or grab something from storage. One night, around 2 a.m., I was watching TV when the power flickered, then went out entirely. Groaning, I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to make my way to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew noticeably colder as I descended. I reached the breaker panel and flipped the main switch. The lights came back on, but just as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard something. A whisper. It was faint, almost like it had been carried on a draft. My body stiffened, and I instinctively scanned the room. It was just storage boxes, an old workbench, and shelves of forgotten junk. Nothing else. Then I heard it again. This time, clearer. A low, rasping whisper, like someone exhaling words they barely had the strength to speak. Help me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound had come from the far corner, where the basement shadows were thickest. I shone my phone's light toward the area, but there was nothing. Just an old wooden wardrobe my dad had stored down there decades ago. My rational mind told me it was just the house settling, a trick of acoustics in the cold basement. But my gut told me to run. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, something knocked from inside the wardrobe. It was soft at first, just a single, deliberate knock, then another, and another. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. A scraping sound followed, like nails dragging against wood. The knocking became more frantic, and then the door clicked open. Not fully, just a crack, but that was enough. The darkness inside was impossibly deep, like looking into a hole that had no end. My phone's lights barely penetrated it. I didn't want to see what was inside, but something inside wanted me to. I ran. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly tripping as I reached the top. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I barely slept that night. The next day, in broad daylight, I went back down. The wardrobe door was shut. I told myself I had imagined the whole thing, that my sleep-deprived brain had played tricks on me. But just before I turned to leave, I saw something. The basement floor was dusty, undisturbed except for my footprints. But near the wardrobe, there were others. Bare footprints, small, like a child's. They led away from the wardrobe, straight to the bottom of the stairs. That was the last time I ever went into that basement.